So I put a blast out on social media asking somebody who was pro-Russia to come on and do an interview. And I asked somebody that's pro-Russia. This would not be a debate. This would be strictly an interview. I would be asking you questions about why you're pro-Russia, questions about, why you support certain actions that Russia has taken, and just sort of asking your ideas or your takes on certain aspects of the pro-Russia point of view, as well as giving you an opportunity to just explain why you're pro-Russia. Not a debate, not making you the bad guy, just picking your brain and seeing why you think what you think. The same goes for if you're a Groiper, if you're pro-Hamas / pro-Palestine, if you're pro the Iranian regime, if you want to free Maduro. I would like to interview those sorts of people as well in the same idea of, this would not be a debate. This would just be an interview. I'd be asking you about certain aspects of things, getting your takes on it, and finding out why you believe what you believe. So if you're interested in that, please DM me, because this is something I really want to do with anyone from any of those groups. You don't just have to be pro-Russian at this point in time, obviously. So if you're from any of those groups, hit me up if you are down to do an interview. And I actually got somebody to agree to do that. When I posted the videos, I actually got some really good feedback from it. However, most of the people backed out last second because being on camera is something that they were nervous about, or there was just scheduling conflicts. However, meet Nick, a 20-year-old engineering Russian-American student here in the United States, who agreed to come on and do the interview with me. While he is an engineering student, Nick does have an interest in domestic US politics as well as foreign affairs, and has a strong standing on fundamental US principles such as traditionalism, responsibility, and unity. Now, I am going to go ahead and say that this is not a gotcha sort of interview. It was not confrontational. It was an interview designed for him to explain his points of view to better understand the pro-Russia stance. So if you're looking for a debate or some gotcha questions, that's not what this was. He's not a policymaker. He's a Russian American who has a point of view, and I wanted to understand more about that point of view and hear what they had to say specifically about what they believe. And on that same kind of thread, keep it friendly in the comments and keep it friendly in general. Don't go harass this person, just be respectful, because they took the time to do something that they're not used to doing. They're not normally behind a camera like this. They took the time to do that and to have a conversation with me explaining why they believed what they believed. Now, one last note. You will see fact checks right over here, and if I'm talking, they'll probably be everywhere. Those aren't to necessarily say he's wrong. Those are to give more context to anything he was discussing that more context could be added to, whether it's just some more background historical information or giving you the information in a way that you can later go back and think about it, look at it, regurgitate it, that sort of thing. With all that aside, I hope you enjoy the interview. Again, this is not a confrontational thing, so if you're looking for a gotcha journalistic interview, that's not this, because this is not the sort of person you do that with. This is to understand and hear from a pro-Russian why they're pro-Russian. First question, overall, why do you support Russia? And you can make this as long or as short of an answer as you want it to be.
Sure. So, I mean, personality aside, I am a Russian American. I'm an American citizen, but I have Russian heritage, and I'm Orthodox Christian, Russian Orthodox, and I have a lot of that culture within me and the way I live. But aside from that, because I try and make my argument without personal bias, um, I'm a realist when it comes to these kind of political situations. And when I look at this kind of war, whether you call it a special military operation or a proxy war, you can tell that there's obviously a long line of history that led to this conflict, of course, and you can take it all the way back to the ninth century when Russia was created, as some people do. Um, but if we're talking merely about what's going on right now, the last 30 years since the Soviet Union fell, you look at it at a point from understanding both sides of the conflict. And at this point, there's four sides. Obviously, you have Russia, Ukraine, and then you have the European Union and the United States, which are kind of separating. I mean, they're trying to align as best as they can. But obviously, with Trump bringing in Putin to Alaska and saying he was going to call him, he had some phone calls before he was actually inaugurated. Um, it's kind of a little overwhelming, but when I look at this, I try and understand the Russian perspective of obviously like, the NATO aggression talking points, stuff like that, that I'm sure you already know of, but um, you have to understand that perspective when it comes to your own country as well. So I took it as, for example, if you had America and you had a power to the south or to the north, like Canada or Mexico, and they were infiltrated or they're paid off or whatever the case was, to where they were aggressive towards us. They get weapons from someone that we don't necessarily like Chinese weapons, something like that. And how would we react to a case like that? So when you think about it that way, I thought, well, NATO gained 15 member states and since the Soviet Union fell. There's obviously aggression on both sides when it comes to this issue. And you have military drills within, I think it was Poland and like Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Europe. I think it's called Europe Defender in 2017, which the Russians obviously saw as pretty aggressive. And at the same point, you have the Russians performing military drills. They have that Oblast in Kaliningrad, and it's just back and forth. But when it comes to reasoning behind why they started this conflict, let's just go to 2014. Obviously, you have that kind of I think it was like the Maiden Revolution, where the current president of Ukraine, he decided that he wanted to take a pro-Russia stance over the pro-European stance, and there were protests, there were casualties, and deaths, unfortunately, due to that. But what happened was obviously he fled to Russia, and Ukraine took a more European stance on things, which enacted Russia to go into Crimea, annex it. They started funding separatists in the Donbass regions, and on goes until 2022, and we have the war that's been going on for 4 years now. But I try and look at it from a historical standpoint as well as current policy between the countries.
No, that is a fair point of view. So, would it be fair to summarize that as you acknowledge that there is some Russian aggression, however, you think that it is in response to NATO expansionism? All right, that's fair.
Yeah, it's fair to say.
Would you be willing to expand a little bit more on what you mean by the historical context?
Sure. So, not to, bore you to death with details, but when we talk about what Ukraine was, what it has been in the past, and what it started off as, the starting point was that you had where Russia came from, the Kievan Rus. They took that name from, I guess it was Vikings that came down through Novograd, and you also had Kiev or Kiev. And what happened was the Mongolians, the Golden Horde, they came and pretty much conquered that southern Ukrainian region to the point where the city had pretty much been destroyed, and a lot of those places kind of lost their culture and so on and so forth. Whereas Novograd, where the Russians trying to kind of came from, they regained some sovereignty to where they still, had their own culture and everything like that, and that continued on forth from that path. So then eventually you have Orthodoxy of Christian Orthodoxy under Vladimir. That was kind of like the first czar, and then that was in the 11th century, I believe, and onward and onward until you have like the Russian Empire and the lands encompassing it. So those lands at the peak in Europe, they stretched out to, kind of where Poland is right now. You had Finland, you had a lot of those southern European states as well, to where those people had some unique aspect to their culture, but they weren't necessarily that. Like Poland existed beforehand. They had the Polish Lithuanians, they had their own state before that point. But the Ukrainians didn't necessarily have that foundation for a state, for a culture. And there were certain nationalistic, I guess, movements within that region over time. I guess the last 100, 200 years. I think maybe the 19th century is when they really started getting into it. But it was always a movement to try and distance those people from Russia. So the most recent example in terms of like a modern conflict, like a World War II type thing, was when the Germans, they had conquered that region. through Operation Barbarossa, and they enacted this policy of kind of anti-Russification with the Ukrainians to get them to support the struggle against the Soviets. And that's kind of the main thing. There was some movements earlier at that point. I think the Polish did something too. They tried to inspire the Ukrainians. Um, During the Revolutionary War period, they had like the Black Anarchists. They had all sorts of factions and stuff. But that was kind of the movement that really inspired the Ukrainians to get their sovereignty, distance themselves away from the Russians in that regard, and they continue onward with that until the Soviet Union fell in the 90s to where they actually have their own state. So the historical aspect defines kind of where those people came from, where their culture was enacted, and kind of where their loyalties lie, I guess. So obviously, there were tragedies like the Holodomor, that affected the Ukrainians more than other aspects of the empire, but everyone in the empire felt at the time. You know, the Russians were starving, the Central Asians were starving. It was just the Ukrainians because they had that area of grain, agriculture that would derive itself to feed the rest of the empire. So I can understand the ethnic tension there, but when it comes to what these people are, I think Ukrainians and Russians are cut of the same cloth. We're both Slavic, we're both Orthodox. This is more like a brother war that's been manipulated from political aggression from other sides, like the West. And I think Ukrainians can relate a lot closely to Eastern European culture and to Russian culture than they can to the West. You know, when it comes to political reasoning, um, the East has been through a ton when it comes to casualties from war, when it comes to famine, all these revolutions compared to the West. There's a lot of blood that was lost there. And I think that when it comes to the West and supporting Ukraine, they kind of try and convince that it was all the Russians. You know, it's the Russians' fault. That's why you're there. You have to join our side when I think it's much more than that. But I didn't mean to ramble on too much, but I was trying just to
No,
summarize all that.
you're good. I have one follow-up question to that. So, do you think that, because it is undeniable that Ukraine and Russia have a shared history and a shared culture, do you think that that shared history and culture requires some form of forced unity? Or with the fall of the Soviet Union, do you think that those states are allowed to their own sovereignty and self-determination?
I think Ukraine definitely deserves sovereignty as an autonomous nation, you know, autonomous of Russia. I think the problem is the political aspect of where Ukraine is kind of this border state between Russia and the West. And obviously, I'd like the Ukrainians to choose their own, you know, passage. But when it comes to great powers such as Russia and the West, it's kind of hard to make that situation work. You need something to put a border between those two powers. And if anything, I'd personally like if it was something like the Union State between Belarus and Russia. Although I know the Ukrainians would definitely not want that. Um, I think they deserve their own sovereignty 100%. I just think that when it comes to influence within their country, it gets a little hectic.
That's fair. So you would view neither Russia nor Ukraine as a Western state?
No.
Okay, fair. Um, For my next question, again, this is one that you can be like, I have no real opinion or no real information on this. So, Russia has been called out by multiple human rights groups for not just its treatment of prisoners of war, but also its own recruits and its own military. Whilst this is something that obviously is more of a Russian policy that is being enacted, where do you kind of rationalize backing a player who does things that are considered less than humanitarian, not just to its enemies, but to its own people? And again,
Sure.
this isn't like trying to call
So,
you out as like a bad person. I'm
yeah,
genuinely,
yeah.
I want to know how that, like, you can even say, hey, I acknowledge it, it's effed up, but I support them nonetheless. Like, that is a legitimate answer in my book. I just kind of want to hear how you think about that.
Sure. Um, well, I mean, just to start off, I would say that, you know, any casualty, any death caused in war is a terrible thing. And the more that stacks up, the more people forget it, ironically. You know, I don't want to quote Stalin, but the quote is 100 deaths is a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistic. People seem to forget the humanity of things. And so I think it's terrible what happens with, you know, torture, of prisoners of war, of deaths, of executions. I think that stuff's terrible, and it's not right. Um, the argument is when you argue morality versus like a strategic move, it's harder to piece that together, make those things work. So when it comes to war, it's almost inevitable that you're going to have casualties with the civilians. That part it's unfortunate, but it happens. It's happened throughout history. Even right now with the Iran conflict, just saw that there was an Iranian school that was you know struck, and it was like 165 casualties, and it's awful. It's awful, but it could have been a mistake. It could have been this. You have to acknowledge it. And you have to work towards a political solution, whether that comes to the law, international law, going to court, whatever the case is. But when it comes to that stuff, there's no justification for the actions other than it is an act of war, and these things happen. So I'd say if there's evidence, those people should be persecuted.
No, that's a very fair response. I can respect that response. Um, in sort of the same thought, Russia has lost over 1 million troops, as well as millions of pieces of equipment and stuff like that. Do you see, or do you think that it might be better for Russia to cut its losses and back out of the war? Or do you think that the only way Russia can move forward is to win Ukraine to sort of counteract the perceived NATO aggression?
I think at this point, there's no backing out for Russia due to a number of factors. And it's unfortunate because, like me personally, I'd love a ceasefire. I'd love an end to the war. But at this point, they've been going for 4 years. Like you said, they've had over 1 million. I know AP News covers the conflict. They're one of the leading news organizations that does, and their statistics are relatively balanced because both sides, you have Ukraine saying that there's more Russians dead, Russians saying the same thing about them. So it's hard to differ between those things. But at the same time, Russia has a declining population, as does Ukraine, and this is due to a lot of policies since World War II. Obviously, the deaths. There's been a lot of terrible things that caused this, but at this point, Russia has 140 million people, and it has the aging population as well. So they don't have another time to do it, I think, is their justification, to where they have an able-bodied population that's sustainable right now, to where they can do some kind of conflict before, they can't really do much, I guess. But um and they also have demands that they've been fighting for 4 years that they're not going to back down on. Stuff like getting international recognition of annexed lands like the Donbass and Crimea, having Ukraine as a neutral state or it's not allowed to join NATO, no security guarantees, stuff like that. And then you say the same about the Ukrainians. They want the opposite. They want all these things. They want their land back. They want NATO guarantees, security guarantees. It's hard, but that's when it comes to negotiations. So it's usually whoever's in the better position can kind of lead the negotiation because they're like, well, hey, we have this land right now. We're gonna take it regardless. So they're probably not going to back down unless they get that land, like 100%, and the NATO, no NATO for Ukraine.
That's fair. Do you see a future in which NATO and Russia can become allies? And I have a bit more to this question. So, the Cold War, and you have US v Russia as a long-term, like historical kind of feature, shall we say, in the way the world is developed. Do you see a potential future where either the US and Russia, or NATO and Russia, or both the US and NATO and Russia are able to become allies, in which actions like this are no longer necessary?
I'd hope so, but I don't think it's entirely possible. The way of the world right now is that the United States has bases, of course, all over, but they have been pulling out and they're trying to pull out. And in terms of doing that, they strengthen their regional allies in those areas. So, for example, in Europe, The president right now, Donald Trump, he wasn't really a fan of NATO because a lot of these member states aren't paying that 2% GDP. And so we're like, hey, why are we paying so much if, even some of these countries aren't paying the full amount when we're not in Europe? They view Russia as the regional enemy while we're, a sea away. But I think the only case that we can ally with Russia would be against China. So when it comes to us pulling ourselves out of these places and strengthening things like the Middle East, I think that we're doing the same there as well. We're strengthening our allies like Israel. Um, we're trying to help out, I guess, like Saudi Arabia, some of these other kind of allies that we have, but we're pulling out of there. We're pulling into Southeast Asia against China. And I think that'll be the final kind of big conflict because of this Cold War that we kind of have with it. Um, and the only way to do that would be to recognize these like Russian demands. We want them to feel like they're, an actual ally, not like the 90s under Yeltsin, where he's asking, hey, can we join NATO? And Clinton, kind of rejects him on that. But we'd have to actually make sure they feel like an ally, I guess. And that's only against fighting greater power with this, I guess it's a um, triple uniworld. I don't know what the terminology is, but you have the United States, China, and then Russia in terms of strength. So I'd hope so, but I just don't think it's likely.
No, that's fair. Um, Next question. So many right-wing U.S. pro-Ukrainian individuals are support the idea of Ukraine winning the war, or at least Russia withdrawing, and Ukraine being allowed to continue on their self-determination path. However, they also call, due to some fraud allegations, some of which have been proven, they call for Zelensky to be arrested. Or at least removed from power in Ukraine. And that's a call that some Ukrainians themselves reflect. There's also a lot of sentiment in the US right that does support Ukraine that is also anti NATO and anti UN due to excessive liberal policies as well as sort of shall we say, global government concerns. What are your opinions on these people and the stances that they hold when it comes to these things?
Sure. So it's hard to really find friends in our government right now, is kind of the starting point. The problem, of course, that a lot of people are realizing is this PAC funding with all various entities, various foreign powers. That goes back to how the United States is structured geographically. Our enemies have realized that we're not going to be invaded because we're surrounded by oceans on our east and west. And our north and south, we have countries that are relatively friendly. So the way that they figured they would go about it is infiltration. And this comes through movements where you can fund opposition groups within the United States to push foreign policies that would be favorable to these countries, paying people off, all sorts of corruption, stuff like that. But when you ask some of these people where their loyalties lie, like these politicians, it's hard to really get a gauge because you don't know if they're doing this for the money, if they are getting blackmailed. I'd hope not, but you never know. Whatever the case is, I don't see a trust in it because the government has their own reasons for why to do things, and a lot of the time it's not for the American public, regardless of party, regardless of affiliation. Um, the younger generation, like Gen Z, seems to know this more than older people, but I can't really trust anyone in there. So I'd have to just be neutral about it, regardless of pro Ukraine, pro Russia. I don't see anything working out there.
That's fair. Um, I have a follow-up question to that. So in the Gen Z thread, when it comes to the online right, that is pro-Ukrainian, they share the same kind of sentiment when it comes to wanting Zelensky incarcerated for fraud, while also still supporting Ukraine in its endeavors in the war, as well as they also, I have noticed, a good portion of online right Gen Z are strongly against the EU and NATO. Do you see the potential for a sort of, I don't want to say alliance, but camaraderie, like comradeship between the pro-Ukrainian online right who holds these points of views and the pro-Russian online individuals because of their shared like acknowledgement of corruption within governments and their pushback against an expanding world government in the EU and NATO.
Yeah, and that doesn't even limit itself to like war between Russia and Ukraine, but that can go for any conflict. I think this partition between the left and the right has gotten worse and gotten better in some ways to where it's almost like horseshoe theory where we both see the problem. We're just kind of looking at different ways, but we do come to the same conclusion sometimes. And it's funny, but I think there's definitely a possibility where we can work together on these kind of things. Because like, yeah, Europe is this like social kind of socialist, liberal area now. Compared to like if you look at Russia and China, they hold traditional values, at least they try to, and they enact some of these through their policies. But when you look at it from a left versus right perspective, you look at our original allies in the West, and then you see what's going on with stuff that we would disagree with as, you know, right-wing Americans, like immigration, economy, you know, whatever else. And it's something that Americans have to realize that we live in America and we have to focus on America first. Regardless of what's going on around the world. It's we're here. So I think we definitely could work together on things, and we have to remember that we're all fighting on the same side more or less.
I've got two more questions for you, and then we can go ahead and close out the interview. Firstly, Poland has accused Belarus and Russia of smuggling in North African, Middle Eastern, and South Asian individuals into Europe to destabilize the country. While these accusations are still somewhat undetermined in accuracy, there has been some further evidence that has come forward to confirm these accusations by Poland. Now, Russia and Belarus both heavily limit the, should we say, immigration of individuals from these regions. What is your opinion on them if they limit these individuals to then usher them into Europe? How do you kind of view that action?
I think the Russians and the Belarusians and the Polish, I think they all recognize the threat that immigration can have when it comes to the foundation of a country and the determination of its policies and government and so on. So obviously, Russia knows this, and to the base that those claims are true, which I can imagine that's probably some truth to it. They realize that this can be used as a weapon. So the Polish recognize this, and they agree with the Russians, but obviously they're the ones getting hit with this. So it's like a weapon. That's what I would say. I mean, I don't agree with this. I like Poland a ton, but I think it also comes down to some ethnic tension there as well, with the populations.
That's fair. Would you say, just on a personal level, that the traditional values of Russia is somewhat of a draw for you to support them?
Yeah, yeah. Because I've looked at some of this stuff. Since the Soviet Union fell, you can definitely see that there's been a rise in. I hope you don't hear a scratching. It's my dog, but there's been a rise in Russia for Christianity, for these traditional values, because under the Soviet Union, a lot of these things were heavily dismayed. So, for example, abortion was legalized within Russia, and what happened was I think Stalin uh, made it illegal again due to we need more people to fight in the World War II. After Stalin, they legalized it again, and people were having abortions and doing non-Christian things, whatever side of that you're on. But in my opinion, so when it comes to this, the right wing sees these kind of traditional values that they try and uphold, and they would definitely agree with that versus, the West and what I was saying earlier with the kind of socialist stuff that they got going on, the immigration problems, so on and so forth. It's definitely easier to side with Russia on those
That's
those
fair.
policies.
We have a few more minutes, and in the interest of letting you talk about something more enjoyable, I have noticed that you're a bit of a fan of nuclear energy. Anything you'd want to share on that?
Nuclear energy is the way of the world, and people are realizing it. So, I started a nuclear engineering club with a couple of people at my university. Unfortunately, I've been pretty busy, so I haven't been able to run it as much, but I think that's a huge component of the future. Obviously, everyone knows about the AI, the data centers, the necessary the power needed to support these things. And when you look at nuclear reactors, a lot of people are scared about them, and that's the whole point that we're trying to get past is that fear factor of nuclear energy. You look at Chernobyl, you look at Fukushima, you look at was it Three Mile Island in New York. You look at these disasters, and that's all you have about it. It's scary. Nuclear weapons, stuff like that. We have to move past that and recognize that nuclear energy is the best form of energy that we can have until we progress even beyond that. We've seen stuff with like the wind energy, the solar energy. They're not producing this level and they come at a risk. So, like solar panels, they don't output 100% of the energy that they're supposed to. They don't give as much as necessary. Wind energy, unfortunately, it kills a lot of birds. But then you're relying on natural things like that versus a nuclear reactor where you can have this running constantly, and even a small nuclear reactor alongside a river, a coastal city, you can power that entire city. And so I think while we're progressing, technologically, it's going to be a huge part of things. I think states within the United States are going to start recognizing it more and more. I know in New York, Kathy Hochul's kind of talking about it a little bit, and she has some incentives about it. So we're going to see some good progress, but I'd advise people getting into engineering as much as possible because I'm not into politics, as a career. I'm an engineer. But um engineering won't go away. It's the job security is the greatest. You're going to be making money and you're going to be helping people with energy demand.
Awesome, man. I could not agree more on the nuclear energy front. But yeah, it was a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you. Definitely illuminating as to some of the perspectives that people have pro Russia. I think in a lot of these things, particularly when you live in the West and are looking at geopolitical issues abroad, that those people tend to have a lot more in common than they realize. Um, that's not always the case, but it can tend to be the case. So yeah, it was awesome to talk to you. Thank you for agreeing to do this. I know it can be a little like but I greatly appreciate it.